Hello, welcome to How to Paint Citadel Miniatures. My name is Adam Troke. I'm the author and narrator of the How to Paint Citadel Miniatures book and DVD respectively, and with me is Duncan Rhodes.
Hello, I'm the painter you're going to be watching for the next hour and a half. It's my hands that are going to be demonstrating to you techniques from the book, so I hope they're nice and clear for you.
The purpose of the book and DVD together is to enable you to paint fantastic looking armies of Citadel miniatures that you can use on the tabletop and be really proud of. The way that the book and the DVD combine is that you can see the examples on your screen that we present in the book. You can pause and rewind as much as you need to. You can really focus on the technique until you've perfected it and then duplicate it on your own models. I could talk more about that, but there's really not a lot of point when you can see the examples. So with no further ado, good luck with your painting and go and click somewhere that there's a place to click.
It's that way.
Go and click it.
Go that way.
And good luck.
Chapter.
Assembling plastic models. Open the box and remove everything. You don't have to do this as carefully as Duncan is. He's just trying to set a good example. These Space Marines have two plastic frames, a small bag of bases and a transfer sheet. With the miniatures, bases and transfer sheets removed from the box, you can begin clipping the components away from the frame, ready to be cleaned up and assembled. This is just as easy as it sounds. Use your plastic cutters to snip the components away from the frame. Take care not to clip too close to the piece itself though. This can have the effect of causing unsightly scars on the model. It's actually far better to clip a reasonable distance from the model and then clean it up with a knife later. When you have all the pieces you want removed, you can begin cleaning them up. To clean away the scars where a model is removed from the frame, you will need a hobby knife. Always take the utmost care when using a hobby knife. Cut away from your body and fingers, and do not push too hard with the blade. Accidents happen that way. What you are looking to do is to shave off the raised stumps by gently pushing against them with your hobby knife's blade. Cut against your cutting mat as shown here. That way if something goes awry, your mat takes the pain, not you. Almost every model will also have mould lines on it. These are caused during the moulding process and are an inevitable fact. Thankfully, they're easily removed with a Citadel mould line remover, a tool that is quite safe to use. Drag the edge of the mould line remover against the mould lines and ridges to remove them, and then rub away any detritus with your finger to check you have a smooth finish. The longer you spend doing this, and the more thorough you are, the better the overall finish on your Citadel miniature will be. It takes a while, and it's a bit boring, but the results are worth it. With the mould lines scraped down, take your Citadel emery boards and tidy up your work thus far. These come in two grains, coarse and fine. Coarse is great for filing down larger blemishes, whilst fine polishes your work to a perfectly smooth finish. It's time to begin gluing your model together. Plastic miniatures are best assembled with Citadel plastic glue, a polystyrene cement that melts the surface of the plastic to create a very strong bond, much like a weld. Carefully apply the glue to the areas you want to fix, and then press it firmly against the other component. Don't apply too much glue at once. Start with a little. It's surprising how little plastic glue you actually need to get a good fix. Duncan is starting out by attaching the legs to the bases. So he adds a little glue to the bottom of each foot and then presses it against the base, like so. Give the glue a little while to set. A few minutes should suffice. Bear in mind that once plastic glue is set, the model is unlikely to ever come apart without damaging it. While this is happening, feel free to assemble something else instead, and bear in mind, though the pieces will be reasonably well fixed within a few minutes, they won't be fully set for up to an hour, so don't do anything rough with them. His first step is to attach the arms. This is done in exactly the same way as the other components, and because he's using plastic glue on a plastic miniature, he knows that he has a few minutes of wiggle time before the model sets. The join actually remains somewhat malleable, so you can always fiddle with the join a little until you have the exact positioning that you want. Hold the pieces in place to see how you want them to look when they're done. Right here you can see a good example of how to use the malleable nature of the components that are setting to get the pose that you want. When it comes to gluing multiple parts together, it's always worth taking the time to make a test fitting first. Once both arms are attached and roughly in place, he then tests out the fit with the bolt gun to make sure that he's happy with it. As a painter, you may wish to paint the majority of the model without attaching all of the pieces. A common practice, for example, is to paint Space Marines without attaching their bolters, so that you have full access to their chest plates. If you want to work like this, don't glue the weapon in place. Just let the pieces set as normal. If you want to work a little faster, however, feel free to glue the whole model together, as Duncan is doing here. Assembling Citadel Finecast Miniature. With your Citadel Finecast model removed from its clamp pack, the first thing to do is clean away any detritus. With the model still on the frame, use a Citadel flash brush to buff the model. This will dislodge any tiny pieces of flash and so on. You don't need to be too gentle with your model at this point. Give the model a thorough brushing all over. This should have no ill effects on your miniature whatsoever. With all the flash cleaned away, use your plastic cutters to remove the miniature from the frames in exactly the same way as your plastic miniatures. Again, don't clip too close to the model. It's better to clean up any scars with a hobby knife later on than to damage your model with your plastic cutters. With the model removed and the flash cut away, you can use your hobby knife and Citadel mold line remover to deal with any other minor imperfections. Again, take great care to obey all the safety instructions pertaining to knife use. Always cut away from the body. The resin that Citadel Finecast models are made from is comparatively soft and very, very easy to cut through. This means you don't need to press hard. It also means that you need to be careful that you don't cut away too much as you work. Make sure you pause regularly to search your model and make sure you've removed all the minor errors from it. It's best to spot a bit that you've missed at this stage than when your model is assembled or even painted. With the flash and other blemishes all cleaned away, use your mold line removing tool to scrape away any mold lines. You don't need to press hard with this, just draw the tool along the areas where you have visible mold lines. Finally, use your Citadel emery boards to buff the model to a perfect finish. Don't do too much buffing, however. The last thing you want to do is to file all the way through your model. Air bubbles are an infuriating but unavoidable side effect of the casting process. Thankfully, they're also easily repaired with liquid green stuff. Liquid green stuff is a hobby product designed to fill holes and joins with a minimum of fuss. It is easily applied and, once set, can be trimmed down and filed in much the same way as finecast resin itself. To fill air bubbles on your finecast models, load your brush with a little of the liquid green stuff straight from the pot. This is then simply painted directly onto the affected areas. Now, don't overload your model with it. Just paint on enough to fill the holes. You can then tidy it up by washing your brush off and, with the bristles still wet, smoothing off the green stuff. This helps to get a seamless finish, which is what you're looking for. Do this until you're happy with the result, wetting your brush again if it becomes too dry. Remember, you can file down liquid green stuff with a Citadel emery board if you need to, although it takes a while to dry, so you'll probably want to leave it for an hour or more. To glue a Citadel Finecast model, you will need to use superglue. Superglue comes with all manner of safety instructions that you must be aware of. Please familiarise yourself with them to ensure you don't come to any harm. The nature of Citadel Finecast is such that superglue will enable you to get a strong bond very easily. Because of this, it's worth doing a test fit on each component before applying glue to it. Then, apply a little super glue to one of the surfaces you plan on fixing together and hold them in place. It will only take a moment, perhaps as much as 5 seconds, to form a strong, permanent bond. When gluing together fine cast models with multiple components, it becomes even more important that you do a test fit first. Superglue dries too fast to allow you any time to fiddle about with the parts while it sets, so it's well worth spending a few seconds having a test fit before you do it for real. When you are ready to glue the model, do one part at a time, taking care to match your test fit. In this example, Duncan first fixes one arm into place and lets it set before moving on to the next. With your second piece ready, fix it into place and hold it steady for a while. Up to about 10 seconds should suffice. Before you paint your models, you really need to undercoat them. A good undercoat ensures that you can paint onto the models and achieve a smooth, even finish. The fastest way to undercoat your models, and probably the best in terms of overall coverage, is to undercoat them with a spray undercoat. These come in 2 colours, Chaos Black and Skull White. They work in exactly the same way, and painters will prefer to use one or the other depending on what they're painting. When you spray your models, do so in a well-ventilated area, either outdoors or an especially prepared spray booth. When undercoating outside, choose a day that is dry so that moisture in the air doesn't hamper your work. Few things can ruin an undercoat faster than a rainstorm. Also, make sure it isn't too hot outside, or your paint might actually dry before it hits the model. Before you begin spraying, you must shake your can vigorously. As you can see here, it looks silly, but it does pay to shake the can for at least 30 seconds, or for as long as you can bear to. The purpose of all this shaking is to properly mix up the paint and propellant. Sure, you feel a bit daft, but the results will be smoother for your efforts. To spray the models, hold the can approximately 8 inches or 20 centimeters from your target and press the trigger, wafting the spray across the models in a sweeping gesture. Always hold the can upright to ensure the correct mixture of propellant and paint is released. As you undercoat your models, pause on regular occasions to shake the can. You are looking for an even layer of paint so that you can see none of the plastic underneath, but not so thick as to obscure detail. If in doubt, opt for less rather than more, and once dry, give it a little more attention. In this example, Duncan is spraying the models from one angle, and when they are completely dry, he changes their position so that he can spray them from that angle too. This is a time-consuming process, but it's how most of us start out spraying our models. It's very important not to touch the models until they are dry, so take care to avoid this. To spray a larger model, the easiest method is to hold it by the base, or to mount it onto something that you can hold it by, in the case of a vehicle, and hold it in your hand as you spray. This way you can rotate the model to ensure you've covered all the angles as you spray. A nice tip at this point is to recommend wearing a cheap disposable glove as you spray. This stops you from painting your hand, which feels unpleasant and makes you look like you've joined some peculiar chaos cult. Perhaps the best way to undercoat several models at once is to prepare a painting stick. Simply put, this is a stick with some double-sided tape on it, so that you can mount several miniatures onto it at once. Here you can see Duncan's trusty painting stick. This one has seen a lot of models in its time. It's really important to be sure that your models are properly attached. If they aren't, they will fall off, which looks bad and can be quite damaging. Don't let this happen. With the models fixed in place, it's a simple matter of moving the stick around to ensure good coverage all over as you spray. This shaves valuable time off having to let them dry and then rotate them. A painting stick is easy to procure too. It's nothing fancy, it's just an offcut of wood or some really stiff card that you'll find in your shed or in your craft drawer. Base paints. Citadel base paints are specially formulated for base coating your models. Thanks to the high concentration of pigments contained within them, they provide excellent coverage even over black and white undercoats. Whatever manner of miniature you are painting, you will almost certainly want to give it a base coat. Base paints serve as the foundation for the techniques that will follow as you detail your miniature, so it's worth taking some time to do them right. As with all paints, before you begin work with them, make sure the lid is on tightly and then give them a vigorous shake. Blood Angels, base coating a model. In this example, we will be base coating a Blood Angel Space Marine. The first thing to do is load your paint palette with the colour you are using. Here, Duncan is using Mephiston Red. For best results when using base paints, water down the paint that you're going to use a little before you do so. Don't make them too runny, but adding a little moisture to your paint is a good thing. Take your brush, Duncan is using a base coat brush here, and load it with paint, then brush it across the model as you can see in this example. Do not apply the paint too thickly. We are looking to do a smooth, even coat of paint that will not obscure detail. As ever, it's better to do a couple of coats rather than one thick one. If there are areas of your model that you do not want to be a certain colour, don't paint onto them. In this example, Duncan doesn't apply the Mephiston Red to the back of his model's knees, for instance. He knows that he'll want to paint them with lead belcher later on. If your brush has too much paint on it, wipe the excess off onto your palette. Here on the backpack you can see Duncan painting across the vent holes rather than painting inside them. This is deliberate, since he wants these to be black when the model is finished anyway. As you near completion on your base coat, keep an eye out for areas that you have missed. If the paint is dry, you can paint again over the top of it to ensure the smooth, even finish that you are looking for. Give the model a once over to make sure that you haven't missed anything. With the red complete, Duncan now continues painting on the rest of the base coat colours. Using lead belcher, he paints on all the areas of the model that he wants to be metallic silver. It's a good idea to be careful when you use subsequent colours, so that you don't paint the wrong colours onto an area that you've already painted. Don't worry too much. If your paint gets into the wrong places, it's a simple matter to tidy it up with the original colour later on. As you can see, To get at certain areas of the model, it's sometimes worth tilting the miniature to make access easier. It's also important to keep the bristles on your brush well pointed. If they're becoming a little too splayed for your liking, wash the brush off and repoint the bristles by running them along the crease of your palm. Next, hunt down any other areas of the model that need base coating. In our example here, Duncan paints the parchment with Xandri dust. Next, he base coats the purity seals with Screamer Pink. Duncan then tidies up the black areas with Abaddon Black. Again, be sure to take a moment to check that the whole model has been base coated thoroughly, including going back and tidying up any places where you may have painted onto the wrong areas. Finally, paint the eyes. These are perhaps the most fiddly bit of all. If in doubt, use a finer brush to help you be more accurate. Here you can see the fully base coated model ready for the next stage of painting. Warrior of Minas Tirith, an all-over base coat. While most hobbyists prefer to base coat their model using the technique shown in the previous example, another good technique is to paint on an all-over base coat. Basically, this involves taking a largish brush and painting the whole of the model in one colour, just as it sounds. When the model is dry, you can then begin adding subsequent base coat to the rest of the model. Base paints are designed to provide excellent coverage, so it's a simple enough matter to paint over a previous base coat, even a metallic one. As ever, try not to paint over areas of the model that you have already painted. It just saves time if you don't have to do it twice. Citadel shades. Citadel shades can be washed onto a model to create areas of rich, darker colour, defining details and accentuating recesses. They can also make painting very easy. Citadel shades make short work of areas of cloth, such as robes, cloaks, trousers and so on. The shade settling naturally into recesses means you can focus on a couple of simple highlights. A wash over armour, chainmail or armour plates will help you pick out all the details on your miniature, making your handiwork look even handier. Citadel shades also tackle hair and fur. These highly textured areas have lots of detail for you to capture. There are 12 shades in the Citadel range, providing a variety of tones for you to use. Applying the appropriately coloured wash to a base coat provides a complementary shade. In our example here, Duncan is going to shade the armour of a Black Orc using Nuln Oil. Prepare your shade by shaking the bottle and use a wash brush to load some of the Nuln Oil onto your palette. Apply the shade neat to the palette. There is no need to water it down. When you are ready to start, make sure you wash your brush and reshape the bristles before you proceed. Then, with your brush loaded, you can begin washing. Washing the model really is very simple. Push the Nuln Oil onto the model. Don't worry about being too liberal. As you work, you'll need to regularly reload your brush. Do this as often as you need to. The truth is, when applying Citadel shades, you can slather on as much as you like without fear of it going wrong. The wash will run into recesses and then dry over time, leaving a very satisfying effect. Of course, if you apply too much, it will run off the model, which is wasteful. But don't be too coy about how you apply it. Perhaps the most important thing to consider is whether you want your shade to cover the whole model or just certain areas. Because we only want to shade the armour on our model here, we're being a little bit careful, but not too much. As you work, rotate the model so that you can cover all of the areas you need. Make sure you get in under the arms and in other recessed areas. Cover the belt, the chainmail, all the areas of the model that you want to be black. When you are happy you are finished, give the model a once over to make sure you got all the details covered. Citadel shades take a while to dry. It's a good idea to leave the model for 20 or 30 minutes. While the model dries, is a good time to take a break. Now the Nuln Oil is dry, you can see the finished effect. The Black Orc armour looks weathered and battle-worn, just what an orc wants before he goes to crump some heads. Bad Moon Orc, section washing. Section washing is exactly what it sounds like. Sometimes you will want to wash a model in a variety of colours. To do this, apply one wash at a time to the desired areas. In essence, it is the same as applying an all-over wash. However, you wait for the first wash to dry before you apply the second. If you don't let the first wash dry before you add the second, they will end up mixing into one another, which looks messy and is generally unpleasant. Section washing is a great way of keeping the colours of your model distinct. If you consider this Bad Moon boy, for example, he would obviously want his armour to look as bright and garish as possible, while his weapons and war gear should look thoroughly grubby and well used. Ultramarine Space Marine, washing over white. Applying a wash over a white undercoat or base coat can provide a striking effect, essentially bypassing the need for further highlighting or shading. Here you can see the effect of painting Cassandra yellow over a ceramite white base coat. Simply load your brush with the colour you want and paint it onto the right area of the model. Don't load too much on at once, it might run down the miniature and cause a mess. As ever, go for a couple of thinner layers rather than one thick one. As you can see here, the wash settles in the recesses and provides natural shading, whilst less settles on the raised areas, creating the impression of highlights. Haradrim Warrior, robes and cloth. Lots of Citadel miniatures have cloth or robes, which are very easily detailed with a wash of Citadel shade. The shade gathers nicely in the recesses. Load your brush with Citadel shade and paint it liberally onto the correct areas. The larger the area, the more liberal you can be. This works nicely for painting things such as purity seals and other small cloth details too, in which case you'll need to be a little more careful. With the Haradrim Warrior's cloak, however, just plaster it on. Orc Warrior, all-over wash. There are a number of models that benefit from an all-over wash. This is just what it sounds like. You simply whack a wash onto the whole model, nothing fancy. This is a great technique for those models that look a little mucky. Dry compounds. Citadel dry compounds are made with a thick consistency, designed to enable painters to easily and effectively dry brush their models. Dry brushing is a technique that enables painters to pick out large areas of detail easily, and is one of the first techniques that many painters master. Perhaps the best thing about dry brushing is that it can be used to detail almost any area of a model, from cloth and beards to plate armour, and even areas of flesh. Once a model is dry brushed, it can then be glazed or shaded at the painter's discretion. There are 15 dry compounds in the Citadel range, each of which can be applied directly over an undercoat or a base coat. The thing to remember with dry brushing is that it is fairly messy, so it's worth doing it before you do any of the detail work on your models. Skeleton Warrior, dry brushing bone. The principle behind dry brushing is to rapidly brush the bristles of your loaded paintbrush against the miniature to pass the paint onto the raised areas of your model. First, load your brush with some of the dry compound, and then rub the brush against a piece of tissue paper until most of the paint has rubbed away. Next, brush the bristles against your model quickly in a back and forth motion. As you do this, you will notice a build-up of paint on the raised areas. The more you dry brush an area, the more paint will transfer onto it, and the lighter it will become. As you paint, you will want to replenish your brush from time to time. Just remember, don't leave too much paint on it. Beastman Gore, dry brushing metal. The principle for dry brushing metal is exactly the same as the bone shown previously. Load your brush with Necron compound, wipe it off, and then rub your brush against the metal areas on the model. Doing this can give you a great looking effect of realistic metal very quickly. Orc Ballboy, dry brushing and washing fur. Fur is possibly the best candidate of all for the dry brushing technique, since it enables you to pick out all of the sculpted detail on your model with incredible ease. The more thoroughly you dry brush the model, the more you will accentuate the details on the fur. Washes sit really nicely on areas of a model that have been dry brushed. Simply apply the appropriately shaded wash to the dry brushed area. Once dry, this will create a very pleasing muted appearance. Space Marine Rhino, dry brushing large areas. Large models, even those with flat surface areas, are good candidates for dry brushing too, and it works in more or less the same way as on smaller models. The main difference is that you will want to use a larger dry brush. Load your brush in the same way and wipe off the excess paint as before. The technique itself is exactly the same. Rapidly brush backwards and forwards, allowing paint to gather on raised areas and edges. This creates the appearance of a natural highlight on the model, and will pick up details such as rivets and the edges of armour plates. Layer paints. Layer paints are designed to enable painters to apply natural highlights onto models. They are designed to paint smoothly over base paints and each other without any need for mixing. With 70 paints in the layer paints range, it is easy to move smoothly from one colour to the next. Layering is also incredibly adaptable. It can be used on robes and beards. It applies well to armour plates and metal. Layer paints also work well on skin, horns and fur. Chaos Marauder, layering flesh. The basic principle when it comes to layering is to paint your model so that the raised areas become lighter while the recessed areas remain dark. This gives the impression of shadow settling into the recesses. This Chaos Marauder has been prepared with a base coat of Bugman's Glow and then washed with Reichland Flesh Shade. Load your brush with layer paint, in this instance Cadian Flesh Tone, and paint it onto the raised area. Don't overload your brush or you will struggle to keep the paint from going into the recesses, and you don't want the paint to apply too thickly. take the time to look over your model so as not to miss any of the areas of the model that you want to detail. It's a bit of a pain to have to go back and add layers where you've forgotten to apply them later on. With the first layer complete, it's time to add the second layer, and this is where the effect really begins to look good. Using Kislev flesh, add another layer onto the previous one, focusing on the edges. This second layer is finer than the first, and to create the right effect, make sure that you leave some of the darker colour showing underneath. As you can see, this gives your model a nice natural highlight effect of light on flesh. As you can see as you work, layering is not the quickest of techniques to utilise, but the results speak for themselves. Dark Angel Space Marine, layering robes and edge highlighting. In this example, we will look at two different styles of layering. The first is how to layer the robes, the second is edge highlights on armour plates. Layering on cloth such as robes, trousers and so on works so well because the folds in the cloth serve to provide natural areas of shade that our paints can accentuate. By applying layer paint to the raised edges of the robes, you can get a very pleasing effect. The robes of this Dark Angel have been prepared with a Xandri Dust base coat and then washed with a Seraphim Sepia shade. As before, the goal is to paint the layer paint onto the raised areas only, leaving the folds and recesses in shade. Here, Duncan is painting on the first layer using Ushabti bone. Because the recesses aren't exactly deep, they're not left too prominent. Whenever you are using layering as a technique, it's important to keep the point of your brush fairly sharp, so that you can control the paint as it goes onto the model. With the first layer complete, Duncan now begins the second layer with Screaming Skull. This second layer is a fairly fine highlight, meaning that it just concentrates on the edges of the robes. The Dark Angel's armour has been prepared with a base coat of Caliban green and washed with null nor shade prior to edge highlighting. The edge highlight itself is simple and more or less exactly as it sounds. Use layer paints to carefully paint along the hard edges of the armour plates, in this example using Warpstone Glow. All edge highlights should be fine. What you're looking to achieve is increasingly thin layers, so when you paint the first one, bear in mind that you're going to need to paint an even finer layer afterwards. Paint the edge highlights onto all areas of the armour, including shoulder pads, backpack and so on. It's quite important to rotate your model and check all over it for any areas that need highlighting. You don't want to miss a bit and have to go back later on. With the first layer complete, it's time to apply the second, in this example with Moot Green. Using a finer brush, repeat what you did before, painting on the layers so as to leave some of the previous layers showing underneath. This is where a steady pair of hands and a little patience will be rewarded. As you can see from our example, focus the second layer right at the edges of the armour plates, and don't worry about covering the whole of the previous highlight. The lighter colour, applied at corners and in limited amounts, provides a really strong contrast that looks great, something any chapter artificer would be proud of. Glazes. Citadel glazes are a special kind of wash or ink, formulated to intensify colour and restore the overall appearance of stark highlights on models. They work by providing a translucent layer across the colours beneath them, effectively altering the original hue. To understand this, it often helps to imagine that you are looking through a coloured lens or pair of glasses. The colours you see through them are subtly changed. The three main uses of glazes are to tone down stark highlights, make colours appear deeper and richer, and to transform the appearance of a colour into something quite different. There are 4 glazes in the Citadel paint range, each of which can be used on a wide range of different colours, with a variety of effects. Chaos Warrior, Staining Armour. This example focuses on staining armour, the process of adding a glaze to a model to change the overall appearance of the colours beneath it. Here we have a Chaos Warrior that has been painted with damaged, grubby plate armour. Our intention is to stain his armour to make it look an eerie green colour. This is actually quite simple to do. Using Waywatcher green glaze, carefully paint onto the model. Unlike a wash using a Citadel shade, you do need to be a bit careful when you apply glaze. A glaze will dry where you paint it, so don't overload it. It's certainly better to apply 2 thin layers than 1 overly thick one. paint the glaze onto all the areas of the model that you want to transform. As you can see, the effect of the Waywatcher green on the model is quite remarkable. What was previously a sturdy looking set of iron armour now has a distinctly Nurgle looking hue. Of course, if you fancy something different, you could try using bloodletter to make your armour look a gory red colour. Or Guilliman blue to give a finish that any Tzeentch worshipper would be very proud of. Bloodletter of Khorne, glazing highlights. Some models benefit from an all-over glaze, especially when they have received fairly stark highlights and you want to tone them down a little. Certain colours, such as red, blue and yellow, are all quite prone to this stark appearance. Thankfully, that's where glazes come into action. In this instance, we're using bloodletter, which is wholly appropriate considering the subject model. Because we are washing the whole model, and toning down the highlights across all of it, we can afford to be fairly indiscriminate with our application. But, even in a situation such as this, don't slap on a glaze in the same way you would a Citadel shade. It's far better to do 2 thin layers than one that is too thick. If you were glazing only portions of a model, it would become even more important to be accurate, so you might like to consider using a smaller brush in a situation like that. Once the glaze has dried, you can see that the highlights appear more natural and the colours seem to have more depth. This looks great, and considering how easy it was to achieve, glazing is a technique that is well worth adopting. Texture paints. Citadel texture paints are designed to provide a swift and effective solution to detailing your bases. Frankly, nothing spoils a nice paint job more than a base that hasn't been textured and detailed, and Citadel texture paints are the antidote to that unfortunate situation. These paints contain a mixture of coarse and fine grit, which form a grainy texture surface as the paint dries. They also provide exceptional coverage straight over a black or white undercoat, and they dry pretty quickly. All this makes it easy for you to paint directly onto your bases before washing or dry brushing them to get a fantastic finished result. There are 6 paints in the Citadel texture paints range, enabling you to base your models in a variety of colours. Basing example, Badlands Mud. Here we'll look at an example of how to base a model. A task that is actually quite simple. Firstly, use your brush to take some of the texture paint from its pot and place it onto the palette. Doing this gives you a better control of the amount you have on your brush. You don't want to be blobbing it around all over your models after all. Once you are happy you have the right amount, paint it onto the top flat surface of the base, taking care not to paint onto the sides or across your model's feet. You don't need to cake this on too thickly. As you can see in our example, a reasonable coating will suffice. Check to make sure you haven't missed any, and, if your base is covered thoroughly, leave it to dry. This will probably take about half an hour to 45 minutes, depending on how warm your room is. Once the textured paint is fully dry, you can then dry brush it using Citadel dry compounds. The grainy surface of the texture paints lends itself brilliantly to detailing like this, so a quick dry brush is all that is required. With your dry brush complete, paint the base rims using a base paint, Steel Legion Drab in this example. Be careful, however, not to get any of this paint onto your newly dry brushed texture paint. Next, we'll add some clumps of scorched grass to give the base some additional detail. This straightforward technique really transforms the overall appearance of a model's base and is quite simple to do. Paint a little PVA glue onto the base. A few little splodges is all you require really, and nothing very uniform. Before the glue has had a chance to dry, stand the model in a pot or tray full of scorched grass and pile some of the scorched grass onto the base, directly onto the patches of glue. After a few moments, remove the model and carefully shake the excess grass back into the tray, leaving you with grass effects on your base. Basing example, Pelennor Plains. In this example, we'll look at texturing and detailing a base using Citadel texture paints and then some grass tufts. As in our previous example, the first step is to select your texture paint and apply it to the base of your model. What's nice to see here is that Armageddon Dust textured paint easily conceals the black base beneath it, showing just how effective the coverage of the texture paints is. As before, give the base plenty of time to dry off before using a dry brush and a Citadel dry compound to detail your base. Here we're using Tyrant Skull. Once the base is dry brushed, you'll need to paint the rim as well, using a base paint for optimum coverage. To apply the grass tuft, peel it from the sheet as you can see here, and then paint a small dab of PVA glue onto the reverse of it. Then, simply push it, glue first, onto the base. Hold it in place for a second, and then voila, you are done. Transfers. Transfers are a great way to add intricate details such as heraldry and insignia to your Citadel miniatures. Many hobbyists shy away from using transfers at first because it can seem a fairly complex, even daunting task. Don't be put off, however. Applying transfers is actually quite simple and, as you will see, can produce results any hobbyist would be proud of. Space Marine. Applying transfers. The first thing to do before you apply a transfer to a model is to paint the area that you're going to put it on with Undercoat. Doing this will help your transfer to blend in better on the finished model. Don't worry that it's shiny for now, we'll deal with this at the end of the example. Next, pick the transfer you're going to use, and with a Citadel hobby knife, cut the transfer you wish to use away from the transfer sheet. Cut as close to the transfer as you can without causing it any damage. This will help it to stick to the model more easily. With the transfer removed, cut away any excess. Do this very carefully, however, you don't want to have an accident. To remove the transfer from the sheet, place it on a piece of tissue or kitchen towel and get it wet. Apply plenty of water to the transfer and leave it to soak on the tissue for a while. After a minute or so, it is time to apply it to your model. Moisten your target area with a damp brush and then, holding the transfer over the area, use your damp brush to push the decal onto the place that you want it. It is very important to keep your brush moist throughout this, we will likely tear your transfer. Then, once it is in place, tease it with the brush until you have it correctly positioned. This can take a while, so be patient. If you need to, get your brush wet again and push it around. Once you are happy with its location, dab off any excess moisture with a tissue or kitchen towel. Finally, to remove the glossy surface of the transfer and the area you have Undercoated, use some Citadel Glaze medium and paint it directly over the area. This is the effect of matting down the shine of the transfer and varnish, giving you a smooth, natural finish. Batch painting. Batch painting isn't so much a painting technique as a system of painting by which you can organise your efforts. Some hobbyists refer to it as production line painting. What batch painting does is enable you to maximise the way you spend your time. You waste less time shaking up pots of paint, loading colours onto your palette and waiting for models to dry. You also get consistent results because you are using the same techniques and colours in quick succession. Something we've found over the years is that if you want to pass the time in a more enjoyable way, stick on a great CD such as an audiobook. Basically, the way that batch painting works is that you line up your models in a row. You pick up the first, and then you paint on the first stage. When that is done, put him down, pick up the next model, and repeat the same stage on that one, repeating this process until each model in your line has been completed to the first stage. Then, starting back at the beginning, paint the first model with the second stage, and so on until all of your models are complete. Knights of Dol Amroth, batch painting. Because Knights of Dol Amroth wear bright silver armour, and their horses wear blue caparisons, it makes sense to paint them separately to speed matters up. In this example, we'll concentrate on the riders. Each of these models has already been undercoated with Chaos Black spray, and then base coated with Lead Belcher using a Citadel spray gun. Duncan selects the first model and washes it liberally with Nuln Oil. To enable him to paint the model without attaching it to a horse, Duncan has stuck the riders to a spare base. A piece of brass rod or even a paperclip inserted strategically into the model serves as a means by which to hold it. With the first model done, he replaces it, takes up the second, and does exactly the same thing. Then, with the third model, he does the same again. As you can see, this has taken on all the hallmarks of an Adeptus Mechanicus production line, and it cuts down on time from one model to another. With all the metal done and the Citadel shade dry, Duncan then moves on to the faces. He uses Bugman's Glow to paint the skin on the face on one model after another until they are all complete. Each stage of the models are done one after another until all the stages on all of the models are completed. Army projects. The latter portion of How to Paint Citadel Miniatures is devoted to a series of examples on how to paint whole armies. In those sections you can find all the detail you need to paint the same armies for yourself. Even if you want to paint different forces, there are a great many transferable skills and techniques that you could bring across to your chosen force. What the next couple of examples will do is show you the techniques that are used in those examples and what they actually look like with some good old-fashioned bish-bosh painting. There's nothing particularly fancy about these examples. They're utilitarian demonstrations of how to combine a series of techniques to create a great looking finished model, and they are kept deliberately simple so they are easy to repeat across entire armies. Army Project 1, Hive Fleet Kraken. In the Hive Fleet Kraken army, Chris Peach demonstrates how to use a series of very fast techniques to paint large numbers of models to a great standard. This army uses a number of techniques we've already learned from earlier in the book and DVD and combines them. Here, Duncan will put Chris's advice into action. Perhaps the best additional piece of advice to give throughout this example is to make sure you always leave time for your paints and washes to dry before moving on to the next stage. What you can see throughout this example is how quick washes lay the foundation to enable you to tackle loads of models in rapid succession. Looking at the example, you can see how to tackle this project. Be liberal with your washes and work at a brisk pace. Try and remember you are painting a great looking army and not an individual masterpiece. A swift base coat over the armour plates adds contrast colour to the Seraphim Sepia shade on the Tyrannid's body. With the base coat on the plates dry, another, more accurate wash provides some much needed shade. Even the weapons are handled quickly with another accurate wash. Using the same shade colour on the tongue helps to keep the miniature looking coherent. Small details, such as the ridges and joins on the Tyrannid's arms, are swiftly detailed with a darker wash. But the army really starts to come together, however, with the application of a few very simple details. Teeth are painted with ceramite white, and suddenly the work looks almost finished. Finally, yellow applied to the eyes completes the job. All that remains is to base the model. Give the texture paint a quick shade. You can then dry brush it using Citadel dry compounds. And paint the base rim. As you can see here, the individual model looks pretty great. But the finished result on the battlefield looks absolutely fantastic. Army Project 2, the Aurora chapter. In this example, we look at Duncan Rhodes' Aurora Marines Army. These are classic Codex Space Marines, painted to match the strictures of the Codex Astartes. Duncan decided to make matters as easy for himself as possible by applying his base coat using a Citadel spray gun. This is the quickest way to get a thorough coat that is smooth and even. First, Duncan sprayed on a base coat of War flesh, which was followed by an all-over layer sprayed on with Warpstone Glow. These two sprayings saved him plenty of time, and bear in mind that you can spray as many models as you want to, as long as they will all fit on your painting stick anyway. With the base coat and layer all dry, the model is actually quite a long way towards completion, and is ready for further stages such as shading and layering. The recesses on the model are darkened a little with Coelia green shade, which will help any further highlights show up even more clearly. It's also noteworthy at this point that Duncan has left the guns separate from the models to give him better access to the Space Marine's chestplate. Some simple edge highlighting really brings out the colour in the model and starts to make it look detailed. Duncan applies a liberal glaze of Lamenter's yellow to the whole model. This makes the green paint look really vibrant and stops the highlights from appearing too stark. With the bulk of the model completed, Duncan chases down the other details on the model, such as shoulder pad trim, armoured flexible ribbing, and so on. The metal is washed with Nuln oil and highlighted with Runefang steel. The same techniques for the metal on the Space Marine are also used on his bolter. The Chest Eagle is given some extra attention with a base coat, layer, shade, and then a final highlight. Finally, the eyes are painted. Duncan keeps this simple with a ceramite white base coat and a wash of Carroburg crimson. All that remains is to base the model You can then dry brush it using Citadel dry compounds and paint the base rim. And it's ready for battle. The results, I am sure you'll agree, speak for themselves. Here is the completed army, a mighty Space Marine force. Each model is well painted, an impressive display of skill and effort. The combined force, however, is even more spectacular, an army that any Warhammer 40,000 hobbyist would be delighted to take to the battlefield. As we said right at the beginning, the goal of this book and accompanying DVD is to teach you the skills and techniques you need to paint your Citadel miniatures to a standard that you are happy with. Don't be disheartened if it takes you a while to perfect your skills. Practice makes perfect. The reward for all your effort is an awesome looking collection, an army to unleash upon the battlefield against your friends.